Hello everyone, my name's Patrick Waterson and I'm from Loughborough University in the UK. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to be one of your keynotes at your conference, and it's a great shame I couldn't be there with you today, but I will be around for the question session following the presentation. I'm going to talk about some work we're doing at Loughborough in what's known as the Systems Thinking Lab. That's not just myself, that's also Dr. Thomas Jun and Professor Roger Haslam. Some of you may know Roger as he's the editor of the journal Ergonomics. And in particular, I'm going to focus on some recent work we've done on human factors and safety and give you some examples of those. So the purpose of this slide, I guess, is to show you not some books, but just some books, but these are books which are a stack of books which are in my office. But the point I'm trying to make here is, I guess, is that we've been doing systems thinking for quite some time, actually. So if we go down to the bottom of the stack, we look at books from the 1960s, 1970s. I think there was a different type of systems thinking going on, possibly. But as we gradually go further up, we get to things like, for example, the work of Jim Reason on human error. We're talking about organizational systems and organizational systems thinking, if you like. And then we get right to the top where we're talking about stuff which has only just come out. So in the last couple of years, so that's things like Safety 2, Sidney Decker's work on safety differently. One of the reasons for showing you that slide is that we tend to think knowledge is something that's incremental, it builds up over time, and of course that does happen, but it doesn't always happen as well. It's sometimes older work is forgotten. So when I was working on some recent work on Jens Rasmussen's legacy, I came across work he'd published in the 1970s, very early on in the 1970s, which really is very much the same sort of stuff which is going on today, but it is often not. It's not cited. Rasmussen's work wasn't cited as such. I think sometimes it's forgotten. Sometimes knowledge is repackaged or rebranded. So I'd say that when we get to the top of that stack of books, maybe sometimes we need to be a bit skeptical about some of the recent works coming out. But I'm not going to necessarily be critical today. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I can do that in the question session if you like. I'm going to talk about where I think we're making progress and where we're striding forward. So as I say, I think systems thinking is a fundamental part of our discipline. It's right there in the 50s, at the end of when the Second World War happened. We've got human factors happening and starting in the UK in the form of the Ergonomic Society, and subsequently throughout Europe and the US and worldwide. Some of the positive directions I take from the work which is going on at the moment in safety and human factors is this movement away from looking at humans as potential hazards to looking at them as more as a resource for safety. And I'll have an example of that a bit later on. So we tend to talk less about human error per se, but we talk about making or crafting safety. The second thing which I think is a good positive way forward is we don't tend to necessarily talk so much about things like violations. We talk about adaptations to work circumstances, and we're going through a unique set of circumstances at the moment, and I'm sure Holland is the same as the UK. We're all having to adapt our behaviour completely, and I think we're quite good at doing that. The third thing I think is this distinction between work as done and work as imagined, and this is associated with my colleague and friend Steve Shorrock, whose work I'd recommend highly, and I'll show you what I mean by work as done versus work as imagined in one of the examples. So there's 3 case studies or examples. One of them's from rail, which is looking at track worker safety. And there I think we're moving away from root causes or root cause explanations and more to more systemic safety, trying to look at the system as a whole. Then there's a bit about construction, which is looking a little bit more about this thing about empowering workers or construction workers to actually take charge of their own safety and to look after each other and look after one another. And that involves things like, for example, job crafting and adaptive safety. And I think that's showing some benefits. The final example is a very short one, and that's from very recent work in April this year, where I was involved with, I was part of the human factors team at the NHS Nightingale Hospital, a temporary facility set up in London. And there I'll talk a little bit about this difference between work as done and work as imagined, because I think it's quite important as we enter into the second wave of the COVID pandemic. just to reinforce this point, I think we have moved on. This is some work which was done by one of my students, Robin Hamer, who's working on nuclear safety and applying new ideas from adaptive safety to nuclear safety. And he looked at a set of papers and research which was carried out in the 1780s, and did a sort of word count, a wordle. So what the words which are the biggest are broader or bigger, occurred more frequently in the data set, and compared that with papers which are published in the last 2 decades or so. And you can see in the 70s talking much more about sort of like negative factors like failures, malfunctions, whereas if we go to 2010, last 2 decades or so, tends to be more positive. So it's about variability, it's about being proactive, looking at success as well as failure also. So bear that in mind when I'm going through some of the other case studies as well. The first case study involves some track workers. Last few years we've had quite a few accidents involving track workers. The picture which you'll see in front of you there is from an accident which took place in last summer and involved 2 track workers who were struck and subsequently killed by a train. I'm often asked if the person in the middle there in the red who's kneeling down, is that a victim? It's not a victim, there's no need to worry. It's actually one of the Rail Accident Investigation Branch investigators. So we were called in by the Rail Accident Investigation Branch to do a piece of work with them, a short piece of work, to look at track worker safety over the years and what some of the factors may be that actually is leading to accidents and various different types of incidents, near-miss incidents, for example. So what we did was we looked at something like 40, I think it was 47 incident reports, accident reports, and we tried to categorize the most commonly contributory factors leading up to either a near miss or a fatality or an injury. And we use that to build what's known as an aximap. We use aximaps quite a lot in our work, and I'll show you one of those in a minute for those of you who are not familiar with that type of format of way of presenting data. We also carried out focus groups with six different focus groups with track workers across the UK, because we wanted to get their opinions about what they thought made their behaviour safe, or sometimes were unsafe, or when things went wrong. The work is not yet published, and I won't be talking about the accident which happened last summer because the investigation report for that hasn't appeared yet. It will appear possibly this year, and I'm waiting for the Rail Accident Investigation Branch to do that first. I need their permission to publish the work as well, but I can give you a snapshot of some of the data and some of the findings. This is very hard to read, and apologies, and I think my video covers some of the causal factors, but I can tell you that the most frequently occurring causal factors in the incident reports were things like, for example, the quality of documentation used by the track workers and how the confusion sometimes caused by that. Also, the loss of situational awareness. It was quite common that, well, not common, but it happened enough to be worried about, that track workers weren't sure whether they were facing the train or the train was coming from behind them. They were on the up or the down line, as we say in England. But there were also other factors in there. And crucially, it's important to realise that we also found other things, organisational factors. So, for example, the operator or the owner of the infrastructure in the UK is known as Network Rail. Network Rail, their policies, their procedures for setting up safety were also confusing and weren't very clear to a lot of the workers. And that came through quite strongly in some of the reports that we found. Also things like local culture, depot culture, where the workers work. Sometimes there was poor relationships between managers and staff, managers and the workers, which meant that they weren't free to speak up, or didn't feel this what we call psychological safety, the ability to speak up and shout something out, or say that something's going wrong. So the important part there is that we've moved, I think, away from explanations which are just focused on the workers to ones which are focused on more on organisational issues and seeing those as a piece. This is an aximap which basically tries to lay out some of the contributory factors according to levels of analysis. So where did they occur? Were they organisational? Were they external? Were they team-based factors, or sometimes individual factors? And this is an accident which happened, a near miss, which happened in February 2018 near Newcastle. And you can see a mixture of different things there. For example, I mentioned procedures used by the train operating companies and Network Rail, but you also got things in there about, for example, the setup of a safe system of work, the failure to use a lookout, sometimes to deviate from the rule book. So we've got a spread of different things going on there in that particular axis map of that near miss incident. The second example I'm going to show you is some work which involves two massive mega projects in London, Thames Tideway and the Crossrail projects. These are projects which last for almost a decade or so. Thames Tideway is attempting to build a sewer, a tunnel under London to replace the sewerage system, which is falling apart. I think it's something like 25 kilometres long, this thing. It's crossing London. Crossrail, by contrast, is a project which is partly underground and partly overground, which is a rail project which is seeking to connect West London with East London, because it's quite difficult. If you've ever tried to get across London quickly, it's not possible really a lot of the time. It takes a long time to get across those. These are huge projects, so I don't think that one of them, I think, is going to finish 2025 or so, and possibly will overrun or so. The mega projects, in common with other projects around the world, sometimes overrun a bit. But these provide an opportunity to maybe to experiment a little bit with new ideas. One idea that they've experimented down there is completely to rehash their training programs, the health and safety training programs. Some of that's very immersive. It's actually, they use drama a lot, for example, stage actors to enact out so a fatality or a near miss, and then involve the workers in the discussions about that, how that might have happened. But there's a real shift towards people as being a solution here. So got lots of different things which are going on. So it's not just looking at failures or mistakes or near misses, also looking at how work has got done, which is done very well on time and safely. So you've got positive event investigations of why people succeed. You've also got things like, for example, deep dives into fatal and severe risk reviews, whole gamut of different things. The real shift here has been towards empowering workers and involving them in safety, rather than just handing over safety to them or observing their work and giving some evaluation at the end of the day or so, possibly a negative evaluation. There's a quote there from a construction manager that the lads feel more involved, that they're actually building what they've planned, not building what we've planned. So they've got some ownership of what's going on there as well. And again, I can talk about that in the question and answer session a bit later on, if you like. So the final example is from work which went on in April this year, and this is at the NHS Nightingale. Nightingale was set up in a former exhibition space, which has actually been returned to an exhibition space known as the Excel in London, a vast complex of, I don't know how many football pitches worth of space. It's actually since subsequently been decommissioned because it wasn't fully used. It was only 40 patients in the end. We were lucky enough to miss a major sort of overspill from the intensive care units in London. And those Nightingales are being set up around the country, probably as I speak. So there's one in Manchester in the northwest, which is going to be set up operational very soon. The key thing with this is the hospital actually had to be imagined very quickly. You had to try and design a hospital within the confines of an exhibition hall, set of exhibition halls. And needless to say, what happened there is that when patients started to arrive, there was this huge gap between how they imagined healthcare work would be imagined and how it would take place, and actually how it was done on the floor. And there were issues to do with things like, for example, confusion about leadership and supervision. Sometimes people were given roles which they weren't really comfortable with because they hadn't been in those roles before. Some people were given new jobs or so, which were ones which they didn't have before because they wanted as many people to be involved or to get involved as possible. And that caused some confusion. Needless to say, you've got problems with the layout of the former exhibition centre as well. There was huge gaps between different wards. They had to build many other facilities to bolt onto the Nightingale. And then I can tell you about, you probably also know that some of the issues caused by PPE, fatigue, redeployment, skills training, all of those things going on as well. So a huge gap between work is done, work is imagined, and work is actually healthcare as it actually happened as such. There were many examples of successful adaptations as well, and for first-class team working. The day I was down there, I saw many examples of people really giving as much as they could to try and make this a success, and I think they got quite far. So there's the key thing I think is that going forward with the new Nightingale hospitals around the UK, there's quite a bit of systems, human factors and ergonomics, everything from workspace design through to team training, through to use of PPE, whatever it might, fatigue management. Many of those things could be carried forward into the new Nightingale hospitals. So hopefully that's given you a sort of like a very quick overview of some of the work we're doing at Loughborough. If you're interested, there's an animation there which is on YouTube, which illustrates some of the principles of systems thinking and how they apply to healthcare. And you're more than welcome to use. That's used in quite a lot of the time in training, for example, in patient safety and human factors healthcare training courses. Please feel free to get in contact with me. We've got a dedicated website called the Systems Thinking Lab, which is largely the work of my colleague Thomas Jun. And there's my email address if you want to. I'll be around obviously in a few minutes or so. This is my attempt to say something in Dutch, which I'm not sure is going to work very well, but I'll try anyway. Thank you very much. Dank u wel.